Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London, and this evening I'm looking at a book which has come to us from the Holo press, Holo Books in Oxford, and the Arbitration press. It's a book in a series of titles, mainly written by Roebuck on arbitration. This one in the history of arbitration. This one is English Arbitration and Mediation in the long 18th century, and I'll explain what that means. It's been written, it's this book here, we'll look at it in a minute. It's been written by Roebuck, also with Francis Boorman and Rhiannon Markless, and it's available, as I've indicated, as a hardback. And the title that Elizabeth and I have given the review we've written is When England Was Never at Peace, Arbitration and Mediation Carried on Apace. Let's have a look at the book, because it actually stretches just a bit more than the 18th century. You can see the front. It's a very nicely printed books. There's the front. It's a hardback. There's the spine, which you can see there. And then you can see the blurb on the back, if I just hold it up straight. Now, the inside back cover has nice little quotes from previous books that Derek has written over the years, and then at the front there's information about Derek himself and the other people. Derek is a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, University of London, amongst other places, and that's in fact where I met him some years ago now for one of the other books that he wrote. And the picture cover is of two bare-knuckle fighters, each with his second and an arbitrator chosen from among the gentlemen at the ringside. So you can see where we are with that. If just looking at the book itself, you can see that the index at the back is by page numbering, detailed index. It's a thoroughly scholastic work. The index also has a whole range of different detail in it. There's a very substantial bibliography or reading list. It's called a bibliography for the purposes of this book, but it's by alphabetic order, and again it's very helpful. It's also got journals and various newspapers, various other things included in it. There's the bibliography there, and then we've got also a very useful glossary of terms. I do think that's very helpful. It's at the back rather than the front. Then what we have got is a chronology for this particular period. And he's going up, because it's the 18th century, we start in 1800. In fact, we start just before, sorry, what am I talking about, not 1800, 1700. We start just before 1700 with the chronology, and it runs up to 1815, Battle of Waterloo. So that's why it's called the long 18th century. Then you've got, again, appendix at the back, cases, and then after that, which is it's a chronological list of cases and decisions. Then you've got the actual structure of the book. You can see it's got a little bit of numbering, but it's got footnotes as well, extremely helpful. And if I take it to the front of the book, let's get to the front of the book, make sure I don't lose the dust cover. There we go. The front of the book, just getting there, is there's the first front of the book, no, two front pages if you like. There's the actual main front page, and there's some of the books Derek has written recently. He's written a number of books, very, very good ones, with a whole range of different people sometimes, but they are very good books, and there's the blurb there, and then there's a dedication. Now, we only review books that we like. I don't believe in reviewing books and then saying good things about them, because no point. Having written books myself, I'm not at all happy about being heavily criticised. It's not worth saying. Let me just say there's some subscribers to the organisation here, and basically people who've been supporting the publication of the work, and then you've got the content section itself running all the way through. Quite a large amount, a huge amount of scholastic work going into this, and you can see from there we get to the preface, which Derek sets out in some detail, explaining how the book germinated and where it's come from. Then there are some acknowledgements. Then we get to part one. It's split into various parts. starting off with an introduction and background. And you can see how the book runs from there. And again, you can see the footnoting at the bottom. It's done with a nice introduction, and then he explains basically how the book develops, and you can see the detail all the way through. Now, what do we say about the book? Well, Elizabeth and I talked about it. We've both been to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies for one of Derek's presentations, which was extremely interesting. So we were able to meet him, and I found it very interesting to see the erudition that has come into the work. But this is what we say: arbitrators and mediators out there, including a lot of lawyers who have had specialist training in these difficult roles, like myself, because I'm a mediator as well as a barrister at law, will glean additional perspectives and perhaps deeper insights into the trials and turmoils of arbitration and mediation by perusing this remarkable study of dispute resolution during the long 18th century. And given the fundamental nature of disputes, the actual processes of arbitration and mediation have perhaps not radically changed since that era. But of course, the social, political and attitudinal landscape, if I can put it that way, was a lot different then, and the comparisons between then and now are nothing if not interesting. Although I suspect quite a lot of the processes, although we use different names for them, the same sort of processes have to a certain extent been used. By the way, if you noted the title and asked long 18th century, what's long, what's that? The answer, according to the co-authors, is that it's the century which runs from 1700, in fact 1698, to 1815, which is the Battle of Waterloo, of course, and very much the change in the time. It's known variously, of course, as the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Elegance, and nonetheless a turbulent and troubled period. Lots of revolutions and wars going on, from the Jacobean Rebellion to the American Revolution of 1776, the French Revolution 1789 and more, and of course including General Wolfe's tragic victory at Quebec in 1759, of which he met his death. So you see, it was a very interesting period in history, and probably one that quite a lot of people are not particularly familiar with. And of course, in their extensive researches, the authors have tracked down an amazing amount of original documentary sources which reveal the ways and means by which arbitration and mediation was carried out during this turbulent era, including court records, law reports, newspapers and memoirs. And as I've said, the detail at the back within the expanded bibliography reading list is extremely helpful. And for example, the authors have traced the formal mediation arbitration process to the dispute between two bitter rivals which created the East India Company, and that was a process which commenced in 1698 and successfully concluded in 1708. And of course we all know how successful the East India Company was. And of course, in addition to that, the book's introduction helpfully describes for us the economic, political and legal background which informed and influenced dispute resolution during this eventful historical period. While the focus of the book is on private arbitration and mediation, there is further commentary on the services offered by the state and by the courts, which I found very interesting, I have to say, because I always like to get a perspective based on legal history. And of course there are chapters covering the legal system itself. That's court procedure and addition, the role of justices of the peace, that they have certainly changed, the basis of the assizes until we got rid of them with the Courts Act 1971, the King's Bench role, local government, of course, much more, because it's a fairly wide-ranging and it's a very, very detailed statement. Also, I think it's useful to note the comments on the growth of legal language and the role of lawyers at this time, because that's when we really started wearing the old wig that I got at the back there, which we still keep, even though we don't use it anything like as much as we used to. I think also the book should pique the interest not merely of lawyers and arbitrators, but I think also a much wider readership, not as page by page. It reveals a quite astounding panoramic view of the dynamics of a dynamic age, in which the many of the almost intractable problems which characterised that era might well remind us of current disagreements today, our disputes, how we deal with dispute resolution, our arguments, our fights, and the conflicts which we face in our own century, which is now, of course, the 21st century. As I say, I think this book will have a lot of appeal for historians as well. And the publication date is cited at the end of 2019, and I'm recording this in 2020, just as we leave the European Union, the end of January 2020. So it's rather an interesting time to record the review. Let's just look at the book for one last time. There it is. There's the front. Then you've got the spine. Probably can't make that out too much. Then a little bit of blurb on the back. It's a nice, it's not too heavy, the book. It's a nice book. What I suggest you do, looking at the detail here, I've opened it in the middle. It has a lot of information, a lot of footnoting. When you're reading through, I wouldn't go into the footnotes in too much detail, because that is really the reference material that Derek and the others have included. But what you have got is a very interesting statement of how things were dealt with. And I do think it's helpful. This, for instance, is dealing with family disputes, women, men and marriage, women in business. You see, things dealing with very serious issues sometimes, and the fact that there were so many problems. For instance, breach of promise is mentioned. Now, we got rid of that eventually, some sort of 50 years ago, but it was important in those days. So you see, you've got a very interesting approach in this long, what is called the long 18th century, because it does stretch because of what had happened and the tremendous problems at the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, with Napoleon's behaviour, and of course the problems of the revolution and all the difficulties with the huge changes of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. I'd like to thank Derek and Susanna Ho, his wife, very much indeed for sending us the book. It's a delight to review these books. Thank you so much for the work you've done. We are deeply appreciative, and keep on going. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.